In 1922, the Soviet Union was formed a new nation that would have a profound impact on the entire globe. It would emerge from the remnants of the Russian Empire. After a long and bloody civil war, Russia, in the aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution, was a country in absolute turmoil, a brutal and bloody clash of arms, trying to wipe out this new regime before it can take control of the country. The Bolsheviks finally succeeded in about 1922, and then came the hard work of trying to create for the first time ever a new socialist country. From out of nowhere, Vladimir Lenin had become the leader of the largest nation on earth and was now imposing his will. Lenin won the war. Lenin won the revolution. Lenin's one of those amazing figures who really are decisive in history. Once got to understand that Lenin was an autocratic character who really didn't want anyone to succeed him. That's true of most autocratic characters in history. But Lenin would have a successor who proved to be the most ruthless of all figures when dealing with both his own people and his foreign enemies. They realized after the revolution that the Soviet Union was surrounded by enemies, didn't have a friend in the world. They felt that way, and they were probably right. And the only defense was to build an enormous army with a lot of tanks and a lot of aircraft and a lot of ships, which they did. In the aftermath of World War II, the Soviet Union emerged as a new global superpower that matched the once mighty Russian Empire of old. All of us who were then young, we were seeing great achievements by the Soviet Union. They launched the Sputnik satellite, fantastic scientific achievement. They put the first man into space, Yuri Gagarin, fantastic achievement. And so people were saying they saw the Soviet Union as a genuine comparable competitor with the United States. Now, a century from its formation, the Soviet Union seems to define the whole of the 20th century. Music. In 1917, the Romanov dynasty fell, and Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks had managed to seize power in the Russian Revolution. This new government signed the Treaty of Brest, with the Central Powers, bringing an end to Russian involvement in World War I. But despite an end to the conflict with foreign governments, the battle for Russia itself would continue for years. In the beginning, it seemed fairly simple. It seemed to be the Red Army, which was an army of soldiers with hardly any officers, and the other army is the White Army, which you could say was an army of officers with hardly any soldiers who wanted to put Russia back to what it had been before the First World War and possibly continue that war to a victory. And then it got complicated for really the better part of 3 years. This struggle is taking place for control of this vast and completely turbulent country. At the same time, other things are going on. There is a famine. There's a war going on between Russia and Poland at the same time. And there are endless mutinies, rebellions taking places, notably the Connaught Mutiny, where the sailors of the fleet rebel against the new Bulik government. So not only is the Bolshevik government fighting for its very survival, but it's fighting against powerful and desperate forces, all of whom have one goal, and that is destroy it. Various national groups formed their own armies. The Ukrainians are the Georgians, and they all fought. There was an anarchist army, which fought all sides, sometimes allying with one, so basically red and white with various other factions. And of course, from 1919, the Japanese, the French, the British, and the Americans all thought they might intervene and save something from the situation. So there were at least 5 or 6 foreign armies, also mostly fighting the Bolsheviks and trying to help the whites, but in the end giving up because the presence of foreign soldiers only made the Red Army stronger, could increase national feeling among the peasants and the workers. But while Lenin, as the overall leader of the Bolshevik, and Trotsky, as the leader of the Red Army, wound up victorious in the Russian Civil War, it was another figure who truly established himself during the fighting. Lon and Try are now firmly in power. The share is abolished. In its place comes the Ogpu, or political police, and to check on the Ogpu there is Rob Cream, the Workers and Peasants Inspection Group, whose chief is one Joseph Banovich J. Party, named Stalin, was born in Georgia, one of the national areas of the Russian Empire. He was the son of a shoemaker, and initially he was intended to go into the church. He attended a seminary. He joined the Bolsheviks at a young age, and he became known for his practical work, working in the underground, organizing bank robberies, and in political demonstrations. He spent a few years abroad, but he was mainly an inside guy, and in the course of the Civil War, he became in charge of all of the Buvik cadres, the organization, and he developed a patronage network in that way. So then he became obviously one of the potential successors to Lenin. Everyone underestimated him because he pretended to be not as clever as he was. He pretended not to know foreign languages. He pretended not to have read anything. So they thought this is a useful gopher he'll do. as a sort of chief whip to get others into organization, and when they have founded a central committee, they thought, well, what's the most boring job on a committee? It's a secretary. But the point is that the secretary, if they have enough personality and power and ruthlessness, is a person who determines what the agenda is, who is going to receive that agenda, who's going to be notified at the meeting, and who's going to be allowed to speak, and who writes the notes, and so on. So, as a result of that, right to the end of the Soviet Union, the most powerful person was the first secretary of the Central Committee. Not the president, not the chairman, and that was Stalin's doing. One of Stalin's key tasks in the Bolshevik Party had been how the issue of the nationalities that made up the Russian Empire would be handled by this new regime. You know, his interest in the nationalities and the creation of the Soviet Union was that Lenin appointed him in 1911-1912 to be his nationalities expert. And Stalin went to Vienna and lived there for a few months and wrote his paper on the nationalities question, which him and Lenin worked out what to do with the nationalities. You've got to understand that the Russian Empire was a multi-ethnic empire. It contained something like 100 tiny ethnic groups, but obviously a handful of big ones. The biggest of them, of course, was the Russians themselves, Orthodox Russians. But then there were Poles, who were Catholic Finns, who were Protestant Georgians, who had their own church Aries, and Chin, who were Muslim. So the big question in the Russian Empire was, how do we overthrow Thier? And how do we liberate these peoples? The problem of national minorities had been a thorny one. Throughout Europe, Woodrow Wilson decided the solution was to allow national groups to self-determine themselves and create nations if they wanted to. Russia was a multinational empire. So the problem was how to organize the different nationalities, and Lenin decided that nationalities should have their own homelands, that the Soviet Union would be socialist and content nationalist in form, and so the republics were formed along these national lines. So he'd retaken and reconquered Ukraine and Belarus. He'd retaken the Caucasus, including Georgia, Stalin's homeland, but he lost the Baltic states, which became independent. He'd lost Finland, and he'd lost Poland. So how does he manage the rest of this empire? What does he do with these nationalities? Because the Bolsheviks have supported their right to freedom, and all of them have their own nationalist movements now. And all of them would really like to be independent. That was the big question. What do we do? What kind of new country do we create to keep these territories within our new Soviet Bolshevik state, and yet give them freedom? And that's the million-ruble question. In December of 1922, the solution that the Bolsheviks enacted was the creation of a federal system of republics known as the USSR. The name comes from the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. It was a union of a quasi-independent, nominally independent republics. It was Soviet because the political form was elected councils. The Russian word for council is Soviet. It was socialist because the other state owned the means of production to begin with. They had the Russian Federal Republic, which still exists. There was a Ukrainian Republic once they'd entered Ukrainian independence, which lasted until about 1920, and there was a Caucasian Republic, which later split into Georgia, Armenia, and Central Asia was still in chaos till 1924, and the present stands Kak in Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kayan. They didn't really emerge until middle of the 1920s, when they'd been pacified. There were great differences between Lenin and Stalin about this new union of socialist republics. Lenin saw it as a decentralized system, with each socialist republic having considerable power over their own affairs. Stalin saw it very differently. He wanted it ruled from the center. He wanted Russia as the dominant force, Moscow as the center of power, and preferably himself running the thing. It was quite surprising given that he himself was Georgian. At the same time as this new state was being established, its leader was falling into a terrible state of health. A series of strokes would render Lenin unable to speak, and a new leader would soon be needed. One man had long been plotting for the position, and he would eventually become one of the most powerful and feared figures in the whole world. In January 1924, Vladimir Lenin died. The battle for succession of leadership in the Soviet Union was now truly underway, with one man, Stalin, determined to come out on top. And then on January 21st, 1924, the moon-faced, balding dictator left the scene as abruptly as he had appeared. He literally died. Overwork. His funeral was a monstrous affair. Hundreds of thousands chewed up in the streets in 25 degrees below zero. Whether it seemed that everyone wanted to pay their last respects, Stalin removed his rivals systematically, with incredible ingenuity, and in such a way they didn't know it was happening. Lenin's great fear, I think, was that Stalin would develop a personality cult that had already developed around Lenin himself. and in fact, Celine this, he built up the cult of Lenin. When Lenin died, he took charge of the funeral arrangements. He wanted to have complete control of what happened to Lenin's legacy. It was Stalin who wanted Lenin's body to be in bed, much against the wishes of Lenin's widow. And once Lenin was dead, this personality cult was transferred onto Stalin himself. And this would become one of the hallmarks of his entire reign of power in the Soviet Union. Darren was left as the sort of leading member of the leadership, along with Trotsky, and there were other major figures, Zenov and KF, and younger ones like Bucher, and as well, and ROV, who were also key figures. But the leading two contenders were Stalin and Trotsky. And even though this is always presented as one of the great sort of struggles, and it was an amazing thing that Stalin won this succession struggle. Actually, he'd really already won it by the time Lenin died. He was already the leading figure in the regime, and somebody had to do something pretty radical to stop him. He already controlled the party machine, and the party controlled the country. So Trotsky was actually his ideal competitor. Trotsky was very arrogant and so famous and so preeminent and so pleased with himself that he really believed that he didn't need to do much organizing, and he would simply be given the leadership. The first thing he did was to tell Trotsky he needed a rest, and suggested that Trotsky go to the Caucasus. And Trotsky, who, although a very powerful figure, could be at times hysterical and have fainting fits and feel suddenly psychosomatically ill, Trotsky consented, and he went pheasant shooting. And the instruction Stalin sent to the locals was he is not to meet anybody, he was not to receive any telegrams or letters. So Trotsky missed Lenin's funeral. And people who miss funerals miss the will reading and miss the distribution of the spoils. Stalin's maneuvers during Lenin's funeral would be the beginning of the end for Leon Trotsky's role in the newly formed USSR, and the beginning of Stalin's radical plans for the nation. Stalin, Zenov, and KB forced Trotsky into exile. Then Stalin overrules his two associates and ends the new economic policy. In its place come 3 successive 5-year plans, all designed to emphasize productive capacity, especially heavy industry and power output. From 1928 to 1941, Russia's industrial capacity rises nearly 300%. After the Civil War, Lenin had promoted a policy of economic compromise, the new economic policy, which allowed quite a lot of market forces to delay communism because the country was so impoverished. And of course, in the Communist Party, there was a wide variety of views about which way they should go, whether they should allow some market forces, or whether they should have a strict communism with collectivization. But at the same time, another big issue was industry, and bazaars had begun to industrialize Russia in the 1890s, but of course that had all been destroyed in the war. And so now they looked towards America, the rising power, and they saw this extraordinary industrial miracle that was happening in America with mass production, and they wanted it too. But while the Soviet Union wanted to emulate the industrialization witnessed in countries like the United States of America, it remained very wary of its precarious place in international affairs. While the Bolshevik Party, which became the Communist Party, was split in its foreign policy, those on the left believed that a revolution in one country could not survive only by itself. So they believed that only a world revolution could bring real socialism. So they believed that Britain, Germany, France, United States also needed to become socialist in order to make the revolution succeed. And so part of the policy was to organize and support foreign communist parties to undermine governments and to carry out this revolution. But at the same time, the Soviet Union needed to survive in the world that existed, so they were also engaging in diplomatic relations with these powers, trying to arrange a trade deal so that they could borrow technology in order to develop their own economy. So there was this two-pronged policy. On the one hand, they were being nice to the capitalist countries, and on the other hand, they were trying to undermine them with their local communist parties. The foreign policy, changed, and he was extremely inflexible with the foreign policy, but the essential thing was just to strengthen the Soviet Union wherever possible, by any means possible. And in that sense, he was actually he was very radical internally. He was incredibly murderous internally, but outside in foreign policy, he was, very much a traditional statesman, making alliances, winning friends, trying to win territory in order to make the USSR great. The early years of the Soviet Union, both Lenin and Stalin, after him, really craved foreign recognition. They wanted this new revolutionary state to be recognized by countries across the world. One of the first nations to enter into negotiations was Great Britain, and you get the Anglo-Soviet Trade Agreement. and then get diplomatic recognition happen soon afterwards. And eventually America itself in the early 1930s will recognize this new state and send an ambassador to Moscow, and soon after that the Soviet Union is recognized by the League of Nations in 1934. This is a key moment for the Soviet Union. At last it's been recognized as an official country. On the world stage, while the USSR would eventually be officially recognized on the world stage, it continued to have extremely tense relationships with foreign powers, but one of the USSR's surprising opportunities for industrial development in this time was with the country. It had been in direct conflict with just a few years prior during World War I. Germany, after the First World War, was a parastate. It wasn't allowed to have an army, wasn't allowed to have tanks or airplanes, so it came to a mint with another prior state, the Soviet Union, and they developed submarines, tanks, and aircraft in various sites on the Volga. Well, this was the first socialist country in the world, so it was a tremendous experiment in transforming it. Economic system modernized the country to build hydroelectric dams, to build the economy. The Soviet economic elite decided that centralized economic planning would be the most efficient way to mobilize resources, so targets were set for every sector of the economy by the center, and orders were given to all parts of the economy to fulfill their parts of the plan. So initially they recognized they needed to build infrastructure in heavy industries, transportation, energy sector, and machine manufacturing in order to provide the capacity to then develop the economy further into a consumer goods and in a broad-based economy. But